Now it's much better. Thank you very much. So first of all, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invite. It's a big disappointment of mine that I cannot be there in person. It seems that COVID still will and can influence our lives in 2023. In my presentation, first of all, I would like to talk about like communities and society in Longobard period.
Scusami, ti chiediamo di parlare un po' più lentamente perché c'è la traduzione simultanea. Ok? Grazie.
Sorry, I'm not on translator mode because then I have an echo. So could you repeat that in English, or I will just change it to...
Could you please speak slowly?
Oh, yeah.
The simultaneous translation. Thank you.
Yes, apologies.
Sorry.
No, I understand. Apologies. I will try my best. And please feel free to stop me if I'm getting too fast again. So in my presentation, I would like to showcase some of the recent results and how they complement earlier results and how they change our understanding of Longobard communities and society in 6th century Pannonia. So where we are at right now, or where we were like 10 years ago, basically archaeological research in Hungary in the Longobard period mostly focused on like categorizing the sites, basically describing types of sites. And in the 6th century, these four main categories were identified. In North Pannonia, which is like today's northwestern Hungary, the two main groups were the so-called 𝐬𝐮𝐥𝐭𝐮 group, and in North Pannonia, the so-called Santander type cemeteries. So both of these categories, first of all, are chronological indicators. They start at the beginning of the 6th century, so like at the start of the Longobard occupation of Pannonia. They are also considered larger, like around 100 graves or so. But these also have, let's say, cultural and ethnic implications. So István Bóna, whose work these categories are based on, showed that the 𝐬𝐮𝐥𝐭𝐮 group is a group that basically a mixture of late Roman survivals, pre-Longobard Germanic populations, and Longobards. So it had a very strong cultural and ethnic identification as well. And the Santander type would be like the classic Longobard material that appears in North Pannonia at the beginning of the 6th century. Then in South Pannonia, we would have the so-called 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 type that Daniel has mentioned in his presentation as well. This would mean smaller cemeteries, around 30-40 graves in South Pannonia, and they belong to like the last phase of the Longobard occupation in this area. And we have like this very specific context, �K𝐻𝐸 which is a late antique fortress with quite a few 6th century burials and cemeteries around it. And how they are located geographically. So this blue area, this is the so-called 𝐬𝐻𝐿 group. This yellow area, this is the so-called Santander type cemeteries. This big red zone is the so-called 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 type. And this, and I can only hope that you can see my cursor. This is �Κ𝐻𝐸 at the southern edge of Lake Balaton. So basically, these types, first of all, are chronological indicators. They also have some cultural implications. So for example, 𝐾𝐻𝐸 again shows very, very strong Mediterranean, especially Western Mediterranean contacts. But they also have like this spatial organization that in North Pannonia, you should find these larger cemeteries that start earlier. And in Southern Pannonia, you should find the 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻 types, which are smaller and start later. Another part of his work was, of course, the classification of burials. And we are in a period when everything needs to be connected in the written sources, at least during his work. And basically, he tried to identify the different classes, the different ranks of society based on burial customs. It's not just István Bóna. This was a general trend between, let's say, the 1940s and the 1980s. And this is basically how we understood Longobard period society till like the last decades. Basically, the identification went that way, that if someone has a spada, it must be a member of the elite, a member of the aristocracy. If that individual only had a spear and a shield, it still needs to be like a free man. But if he doesn't have like any kind of weaponry, then he must have like a servant or a slave. Like these two ways of understanding communities and society are very hard to like really combine. So basically the 𝐬𝐿 group, which was identified as a mixture of late Roman survivals and pre-Longobard Germanic population groups and Longobards, have plenty of these like empty burials, but in those cemeteries, they were identified as surviving late Roman population groups. So basically on a social level, but in other cemeteries, the same burial customs would be identified as slaves, for example, which of course could still mean the same origin, but it really showcases the problems that we had in Hungarian archaeological research. And of course, quite a bit changed with the appearance of processual archaeology, where the many different types of identities first appeared in the discourse that led to like really the emergence of archaeology of identity in the Longobard period as well. My case studies that I want to present today are all located in the Little Hungarian plain. This is this area in this bracket. This is a plain, like hence the name, but the name is also misleading. It's not just Hungary, it also extends to the southwestern part of Slovakia as well. This is a plain heavily divided by rivers, but it also still remains an open plain in a way that there were like no hilly areas between them. And why is this region especially interesting? First of all, because of its location. This is a map that I created. It shows all 6th century cemeteries that have been excavated so far in the territory of the Czech Republic, in the territory of Austria, Slovakia, and Western Hungary. And this area here, this open area just south of the Lake Fertő and somewhat north of the Lake Balaton, this is the Little Hungarian plain. This is one of the most densely populated areas during the 6th century. And contrary to like this classification of sites that I've tried to discuss at the beginning, like the Santander type, the 𝐬𝐿 group, etc., in this region, you basically find all the different types that I mentioned. We have huge cemeteries like Bratislava Rušovce, which is basically the largest one in the 6th century. Right now that we know, it's around 120 burials. We also have small cemeteries like Gyermót with 27 graves. It should belong to the 𝐻𝐿 type, so should be south of Lake Balaton. We also have very small burial groups like Moson Szent János with only 3 burials. And we also have, or probably have, single burials as well, like the so-called princely grave at 𝐬𝐿𝐻𝐿. All of these are basically located in the Little Hungarian plain. And on this map, you can see that it's clearly very densely populated. Basically, we have more sites from the Little Hungarian plain in like a fairly small area. So just comparison, the whole territory of the Little Hungarian plain is 1/20 of Lombardy. So this is like 450 square kilometers. It's a fairly small region. I mean, it's not small in Hungary, but compared to like proper regions, it's, let's say it's fairly small. So we have like this densely settled area. And because of this interesting combination of different types of sites, we decided to do comprehensive genetic analysis on a few of them to like really try to understand what we could add to the picture that we already have about the communities and society in the Longobard period. So without disrespecting István Bóna's work, the typology that he made based on the sites, it's clearly not working anymore. We have a lot more sites, and of course that changes the picture. But our basic understanding and the fundamentals remain the same. Basically, what we know is that these are heterogeneous communities that probably integrated different groups of various cultural, ethnic, and social backgrounds. And we also know that this is already a stratified society with social and economic differences already here. What we don't know, however, is this status inherited, or is it like a prestige-driven community where everyone needs to really like find its way to the higher ranks, or can it be like inherited? And we hope that the combination of isotopic and especially eDNA analysis and comprehensive sampling of whole cemeteries would be able to add more information and like lead to a better understanding of these questions. So what are the questions? The main questions that I have in my presentation today is, are there differences between communities in the same region, the same region being the Little Hungarian Plain? What is the relationship between communities in a region? How did communities form? How does biological relatedness relate to social kinship? And are there changes, developments over time during this period in this specific region? And now I would like to move to the genetic results. The results, or like the type of analysis that we did, will look quite similar to what Daniel has spoken about in his presentation. I won't go into details. What I would like to focus on is kinship analysis and show how biological relatedness is structured in the different sites. I would like to start with 𝐬𝐻𝐿. It is located just south from the Lake Fertő. This is basically the northwestern part of the Little Hungarian Plain. It's a fairly large cemetery with 81 graves. And 6th century cemeteries in Pannonia are a lot smaller than Longobard period cemeteries in Italy. Of course, the whole area was occupied for, let's say, 50, 60 years maximum. But still, it's a fairly large site, and this is the naming site of the so-called 𝐻𝐿 group. So what we've seen is that it has multiple relatively large pedigrees. These are still smaller pedigrees than, for example, the pedigree we identified in Convegno, but these are fairly large in the 6th century. In the 7th century of our period, we have some huge pedigrees, pedigrees that include more than 200 individuals. Compared to those, these are small, but still the ones in 𝐻𝐿 are the largest one that we have found in the 6th century. Going into detail, like for example, this is one of the largest pedigrees that we have. You can see that it's 3 generations, which in a way fits really well to the archaeological dating of the site. So around 60 years, that also works in terms of biological generations. You can see that with the exception of this individual marked with 70, all of them are males. Squares mean a male, square mean a male, and circles are always females. Basically, what we see here is a grandfather, father, son, 3 generations, and then 3 siblings that belong. Basically, 69 is the uncle of these 3 siblings. So the method that we are using is actually able to identify the quality of this relatedness. So we are able to tell like what's the degree of relatedness. We are able to tell it up to like 3rd degree. That means, let's say we know that 40 is 2nd degree relative of 47, but we don't know who is the grandfather or who is the grandchild. We also don't know whether it's really like a grandfather-grandchild connection. It could be also like uncle and niece, etc. So there are multiple ways to interpret it. That's where like archaeology and physical anthropology comes in. For example, the age at death could help us to understand like who is the parent, who is the son, etc. Because of course, like 2 years old children, it's very unlikely that they are the fathers or grandfathers, for example. So the whole situation is more like a puzzle, but it becomes widely interesting if we compare it to the archaeological data. For example, we have these 3 generations of males, and they are all buried with a very specific way. First of all, these are not richly furnished burials. It's very interesting that in the Little Hungarian Plain, most of the phenomena that archaeological research ties to Longobards, like these wooden structures in burials, very deep graves, stamped in pottery, etc., those are mostly missing. they are only present in very few sites. So there is like, seems to be like a regional difference, like in Szentendre, which is around Budapest, like today's Budapest, at the curve of the Danube. We have all those things. That's why this like differentiation between the 𝐻𝐿 group and Szentendre appeared for the first time in the works of István Bona. But basically, like these very characteristic phenomena that we try to tie to the Longobard period are mostly missing in the Little Hungarian plain. It doesn't mean that the burial customs are simple. For example, we have these 3 generations of males, all of them buried with a bunch of arrowheads next to their feet. You can see that like the grandfather has them, the father has them, and the son has them as well. Like how to interpret it, I have like no idea. I'm open to suggestions. They can be hunters. They maybe just like arrowheads for some reason, etc. But I think it's very interesting that we have like this very distinct burial custom. They are the only ones buried this way, and they are also 3 generations of males, probably belonging to like, this is probably a family custom, for example. Then we have like more easily understandable customs as well. This is another pedigree. You can see that it's again mostly dominated by males, and all of these males are buried with weapons. I hope you can see them on the grave drawings. This is a spear here. This is a spata. There is an ambo at the head of this individual, and also there is a spearhead. The only male individual that's missing weaponry is this individual 35. This is a small child, died around 3 years old, so probably that's why no weapons is interred with him. I also have to apologize. These numbers, these are not grave numbers, they are the sample numbers, and this is how all the genetic information is produced right now in the project based on sample numbers. So these are not the exact grave numbers, how you would be able to identify these graves in a publication, for example. And then we have a much larger pedigree at 𝐻𝐿. You can see it's fairly complex, and this is where it comes in that the exact nature of these connections are very hard to identify, and sometimes these are unsolvable puzzles. We have core families here, we have 3 generations here, but otherwise what we know is that there are a bunch of individuals not distantly related, because these are all 2nd, 3rd degree relationships. We just can't figure it out how these parts actually fit together. But this pedigree, I think, is super interesting in 𝐻𝐿, mostly because it actually has a female line. So while we see a strong patrilineality in 𝐻𝐿, there are also females who have their ancestors and their offsprings in the same community as well. In this core family belonging to this large pedigree, we also find very strong correlation between grave goods and biological relatedness. What you find is that the father is buried with a spata and a spear. That grave is dated to, let's say, the first half of the 6th century. At that point, funeral representation of males are quite simple. It's basically about the presence and absence of weapons. That's why these were used as indicators of social or economic status by István Bona as well. Basically, I absolutely agree that having weapons, especially multiple weapons in a burial, is a sign of an increased economic and also probably social status. That's what we see in the burial of the father. And then he had 3 male children. One of them died quite early, that's 25. And 20 and 23 actually has the most elaborate grave goods in 6th century Pannonia in male burials, especially in like the first half of 6th century. So what you see is that there is this small young individual died around 8 or 10 years old. He actually had a gilded spear. The size of the spear indicates that it was actually a toy. It's cannot be considered a real weapon. But more interesting is 23. This is an almost adult individual. He also died quite early, around the age of 18. And he was buried with a copper alloy bowl, so-called perlentbecken, a scale, a francisca, an antler comb. This is basically the most elaborate set of grave goods in a male burial that we can expect or we can have up until the middle of the 6th century in Pannonia. Interestingly, we don't find this strong correlation between grave goods and biological relatedness in terms of females. We have this line, you can see that the first individual is buried with brooches, a bow brooch and a disc brooch decorated with garnet inlays. Her daughter basically has no grave goods whatsoever, and also her granddaughter only has like 3 beads and a very simple copper alloy fragment. And it's important to note that these burials are undisturbed. So it's unlikely that something was actually taken from the burials. That's why I chose this line. We have another one as well, but grave disturbance is a big issue in any kind of burial analysis in Pannonia. If we move to Celeste, which has a very similar chronology, it again starts at the end of the 5th century and goes up till the middle of the 6th century. What we see is that while the genetic background is quite similar, so again, both of these sites are dominated with this like blue background, which corresponds to Central European, Great Britain, North Europe, etc. Both of these sites have very similar genetic backgrounds, but the structure and the nature of pedigrees that we were able to identify are quite different. In Celeste, we only have these fairly small pedigrees, mostly core families, and sometimes with like one distantly related individual. Still, it's very interesting because we can see that core families, like this father and 2 adult sons, are buried in the somewhat same region of the cemetery, but the distantly related individuals actually separated from them. We have multiple examples like that, and we also have like this strong correlation in terms of male burials. So for example, in this pedigree, we have these 4 closely related individuals, 2 generations of males and the granddaughter, and they are buried together. These are the 4 graves to the east. And we have 1 distantly related individual buried somewhat separate in the cemetery again. It's important to note that, again, this is a core family with 3 males, where all males are buried with weaponry. So it seems that even in Celeste, with these small pedigrees, we have like this strong correlation between biological relatedness and burial customs. We, again, don't have this correlation in case of females. So we thought a lot about the possible interpretation of the difference between 𝐻𝐿 and Celeste, 2 sites of similar sizes, similar chronology, probably used for around 60 years. And one of them have a lot more extensive, larger pedigrees than the other. And if you look at the strontium isotope results, we can see that the strontium values at Celeste are highly variable. It probably indicates that mobility, both on an individual level and on a group level, was very important in this community. Basically, people probably are leaving, but definitely are coming to this community. And this high mobility could be an interpretation to the presence of only smaller pedigrees. Basically, they are not staying long enough to like have these larger groups. And it's important to say it again that we sampled every individual in every cemetery. That doesn't mean that we have genetic data from everyone due to like bad preservation or different issues. We have some missing graves, but we have a comprehensive data set now. So it's very unlikely that these pedigrees would have been, let's say, a lot larger because we are not missing that much information. So what about the much smaller sites in the LHP? 𝐬𝐨𝐜𝐿, and 𝐵𝐵. We have 3 sites. All of them are between 25 and 40 graves. So in terms of size, they are less than half of the earlier ones. They are comparable to like SOLAD that was mentioned multiple times, and I will mention it for a second as well. Basically, what we found is that these small sites that are usually described as family cemeteries have very minimal biological relatedness inside them. In 𝐶𝐻, we only had 2 pairs of parent-offspring duos. In 𝐬𝐨𝐜𝐻, we only had 1 third-degree relationship. And in 𝐵𝐹𝐻, we basically weren't able to identify any kind of biological relatedness. So basically, in these cemeteries, no one was biologically related to anyone, which is, I think, quite surprising, because our basic understanding and what �𝐻𝐿 and Celeste showed us, and also especially SOLAD, is that these communities were formed around biologically related individuals. You can call them, I don't know, families, clans, phara, etc. But the core should be biologically related individuals. And this is not what we see in the small cemeteries. And it's very interesting to compare it to SOLAD, which, as mentioned multiple times already, was basically formed around a large biological kindred. That like covers most of the northern part of the cemetery. So just at the middle of my presentation, a few notes, what we think right now. First of all, we are very far to have like final conclusions. We are in the middle of the analysis, but we can now say that biological relatedness indeed played a part in the formation of these communities, but it's not an exclusive role. Like we can already see that there are missing biological relatedness in small sites. Biological relatedness is usually reflected in the burial customs, like in the spatial organization of the site or in terms of grave goods. So in most cases, we are pretty sure that biological relatedness is indeed social ties. So these are like familiar relations or like different types of social connections. But we also have to note that some connections might be invisible for genetic analysis. The most important connection of that is the connection between wife and husband. In best case scenario, wife and husband are not related genetically. That connection only becomes visible if they have an offspring together. And this is like something that we have to always keep in mind, that some of the unrelated females might have been wives who died before having a child together with someone in the community. And we also identified differences between different communities. So what does that mean, and how can we use to really understand the relationship between these communities and sites in the Little-Hungarian plain, and how can we relate it to like later developments? First stop would be communications and connectivity. And this is, again, where genetics can go hand in hand with archaeology. There is an analysis called by identity by descent analysis, and that's exactly the same what Daniel spoke about. This is basically how you can identify these very hard to describe connections between sites. These are like sometimes very distant connections. How this works is basically it tries to identify shared IBD segments of the chromosome. You can see that this orange part that's like connected, that's the shared segment. And based on these shared segments, you can identify the strengths of connections, because that means that at a certain point, your ancestry was the same. This point in IBD can be like 7 generations back. And it's important to keep in mind that 7 generations mean thousands of ancestors for each individual. So I might have 7th degree relations with anyone in the room in Grosseto without actually meeting with him or her anytime in my life. So these does not mean important social ties. These, however, can be used to trace connections between sites, not necessarily on the individual level. So having one connection between 2 sites, that's basically doesn't mean anything. But if we put them in a network analysis, we can describe whether certain sites have a more tight connection to each other or whether they are more separable. Looking at this IBD, this analysis also identifies the same pedigrees that the first analysis, the kinship analysis I showed. So these two green blocks in the middle are the large 𝐻𝐿 pedigrees that I've showed you. And these have like very strong ties between them because these are like first and second degree relationships. But you can see that this IBD analysis actually identified that these pedigrees are more distantly, probably like fourth, fifth degree, are also related to each other. But it also identified smaller groupings, and it also identified small groups that are connected to each other between sites. So for example, in this small world, in this network, we have 4 individuals from 𝐻𝐿 and 7 individuals from 𝐸𝐿 that are more connected to each other than anyone else in the Little Hungarian plane. We are trying to test it with isotope analysis, but we might be able to say that this could be the result of internal mobility or mobility between sites and communities, for example. And what's very interesting is that the small site, the yellow being 𝐬𝐨𝐜𝐿 and the blue being 𝐵𝐵, these small sites actually have a lot more connections to other sites than connections inside them. So even though there are no biologically related individuals inside the site, they are still connected to this large network. For example, this individual from 𝐬𝐿 has very strong connections to one of the 𝐻𝐿 pedigrees. This is probably like a 4th, 5th generation connection. So it doesn't necessarily mean like or held a social meaning, but it's still very interesting to see. This is really a preliminary work. We are trying to really like go forward with it because I think the potential is immense. And it's especially interesting if we combine it with archaeological analysis. This is again a network based on brooch types. Each connection between sites means that the same brooch type is present in both sites. So if there is a connection between Szentendre and 𝐻𝐿, for example, there are like 4 different connections. That means that there are 4 different types that are the same in both sides. It's a very rudimentary analysis, but it already shows that most of the sites are actually forming a dense network. You can identify also some regional sub-networks. So for example, 𝐸𝐿, 𝐻𝐿 are next to each other, which makes sense. And also 𝐬𝐿 is nearby. Some of the sites are missing because not every site has brooches, of course. This one is solely based on brooches. But if we look behind this network, we can also understand in a second that this network is actually driven by a few brooch types, especially 2 brooch types, the Schwarz-Pallersdorf type and the Varplotta 19 types. These are the most common small brooch types in Pannonia. They are also still present in Italy in the 1st generation. And these are types that really appear, let's say, around the 530s or later on. Varplotta 19 type is a bit later. And they are started to be distributed all over Pannonia. They also appear in Lower Austria. They also appear in today's Czech Republic as well. So basically, like the dispersion of these objects. And I think that even though we have some examples from today's Southern Germany and Western Europe, because of the high number of objects of these types in Pannonia, I think these are in a way locally developed or at least locally manufactured as well. And because it disperses so quickly over this large area and in big numbers, I think it's a sign of a very dense communication network that is already present, and its distribution is based on that network. And what else is happening around the middle of the 6th century when these brooches suggest a dense communication network? It's a quick and dramatic change in male burial customs. So before, let's say, 530, so like the first third of the 6th century and around the middle of the 6th century, male representation is very, very, let's say, easy to understand in male burials. you have weapons or you don't have weapons. There are no elaborate belt sets. There are very few buckles. Most of them are actually, you actually have quite a few buckles, but most of them are very basic iron belt buckles. And what happens is that in the middle of the 6th century, and especially during the second half, there is this sudden change in the male representation. First of all, belts and belt sets are appearing. And also gilded objects like decorated weapons start to appear as well, both shields and swords. One of the most interesting sites is this very small site in northwest Hungary called Szent János. 3 burials, 2 of them adult males with weapons. Unfortunately, most of the graves were destroyed, like most part of the graves were destroyed during mining work, but the remaining object still suggests a very high social and economic position. You have buckles, shoe buckles actually, with the machining. You have umbos decorated with gilded needs. You have gaming pieces made of ivory. Its direct parallels are known from North Italy around the area of 𝐿𝐻𝐵𝐵. You also have gilded parts of the belt, and you have this silver, very thin silver sheet decorated with an ornament that I will come back to in a second. We also have gilded weaponry from Guillermo. This is the only sword that we have. It didn't come from a cemetery. It was actually found in the river. Its parallels dates to the second half of the 6th century and has great parallels all over Western Europe. And it's not just this sudden appearance of let's say, gilded objects and belts in the male burials. It's also a change of ornamentation. The first animal style in Pannonia is a female style. Basically, we don't really have any surface in the male burials on the male costume. Of course, it could be textiles, but that's nothing that we are able to see. There is no metal surface or any kind of surface that they can decorate and would survive till today, so we can excavate. But in the middle of the 6th century, second half of the 6th century, these objects, these gilded objects, belts, etc., start to appear, and what used to be a female decorative style becomes a mostly male-dominated style in Pannonia. So the second animal style is actually mostly known from male objects. So we have this sudden change in male burial customs, and that I would identify or understand as an emergence of a so-called, let's say, warrior elite. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist before. I just think that its importance somehow rises in the second half of the 6th century, might be the result of migration to Italy, might be a result of access to more gold, to more plunder, for example, that emphasizes this economic differentiation more. And I arrived to my conclusions, and I would like to end it with a very provocative question. So the LHB, it's definitely a central area in the 6th century. It's densely populated. It has all types of different sites, and it connects multiple regions. It has a central region. It connects Lower Austria. It connects the Czech areas, and it also connects, let's say, South Pannonia as well. There are clear similarities, but also clear differences between communities, between their size and structure, and how biological relatedness might have played a role in their formation. But what we see is that during the 6th century, this very strong communication network develops in the region. And this is something that we want to test in different regions as well. There is the spread of probably locally developed, but definitely locally manufactured artifact types. And there is this sudden change in male funeral representation that indicates the rise of a warrior elite. And yeah, I arrived to my provocative question: are these signs of an ethnogenesis? This is something that I cannot answer now, but I definitely see the development and emergence of a common identity in the Little Hungarian plain. And in 𝐶𝐨𝐲𝐻𝐿 project, our next steps are to do a similar kind of analysis in multiple different regions. We are analyzing 3 cemeteries in southern Moravia. We are analyzing 3 cemeteries in Lower Austria. We are analyzing 4 cemeteries in South Pannonia, multiple sites at 𝐶𝐨𝐧𝐬, and also in Slovenia. And I think if we combine the results of all these different regions, we might be able to say whether these trends are similar in different regions or there are like basic archaeological and genetic differences between the regions. And at the end, I would like to thank my collaborators as well, because of course, I made this presentation, but I wouldn't be able to do it with a set of people at the Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest, the Stony Brook University, and especially 𝐬𝐨𝐜𝐿, who is working with me on the Little Hungarian Plain sub-project. And I thank Corinna Knipper for the isotopic results. And also, thank you very much for your attention.
Sicuramente un progetto eccezionale che ha un'ampiezza e un livello di dettaglio straordinari. Io ringrazio molto Istvan e con lui i coordinatori, appunto tutti i membri di questo ampissimo progetto. È un progetto che ci permette di scendere a scala 1-1, cioè di conoscere l'individuo, i suoi parenti, la sua cultura materiale, la posizione nella necropoli, eccetera. Quindi è veramente interessante questa analisi di tutti gli individui di una necropoli, ed eravamo partiti così quando analizzavamo 𝐻𝐸LAD confrontata con Convegno. Adesso queste comunità con questo grado di approfondimento vengono correlate, cioè se ne analizzano parecchie nello stesso bacino, nello stesso territorio, e quindi c'è la possibilità di confrontare più necropoli dello stesso territorio. Un fatto a mio avviso veramente entusiasmante, che ha delle potenzialità straordinarie, perché guardiamo le generazioni. Questo peraltro ci permette di capire meglio lo sviluppo di una necropoli e peraltro anche di verificare le cronologie degli oggetti, per esempio, banalmente. Mi pare che ci sia, Istvan, correggimi se sbaglio, di nuovo ancora una altissima percentuale di blu, cioè di centro-nord europei, anche con una punta arancione scandinava. Mi pare che ci sia un rosso tra tutti i quadrati e i tondi che abbiamo visto, cioè un profilo genetico dove i genetisti non se lo aspetterebbero nel bacino dei Carpazi. C'è, mi pare, a detta degli isotopi, un'altissima mobilità. C'è un'interessante corrispondenza con la cultura materiale. La Pannonia è una regione sicuramente molto importante in cui si consolidano determinate relazioni e poi partono. Quindi sicuramente è un punto di osservazione privilegiato, e questo approccio sicuramente ci dà tantissimi dati di diversa natura per inquadrare meglio il significato di una tomba con corredo, una tomba senza corredo, eccetera. Cioè, quando l'archeologo da solo arriva a porsi delle domande, dialogando con la genetica, gli isotopi, l'antropologia, eccetera, sicuramente mi sembra che i risultati, cioè che le prospettive siano veramente molto forti, importanti, interessanti, sia per conoscere la comunità, quante famiglie, cioè la struttura sociale di ogni comunità, grande o piccola che sia, e si possono confrontare, e sia la rete che si viene a creare anche attraverso individui, connessioni sia genetiche che culturali tra comunità in uno stesso territorio, e allargheranno l'indagine alla Moravia, alla Bassa Austria, alla Slovenia, quindi un fatto a mio avviso veramente eccezionale. E quindi ringraziamo moltissimo Istvan e naturalmente Walter Paul, Patrick Ghiri, cioè tutti coloro che hanno autorizzato questa relazione con dati inediti ancora in via di discussione. presentati in maniera molto dettagliata e i dettagli possono far venire tante idee, no? All'interno di queste storie, di queste comunità che sembra di vedere da una foto di famiglia quasi. E quindi è un fatto veramente, a mio avviso, straordinario. È un approccio non l'unico, ma uno degli approcci possibili e che sta dando frutti sempre maggiori, perché è un aumento esponenziale quello del campionamento. Fino a qualche anno fa erano pochi, adesso con questi grandi progetti si coprono intere necropoli e interi bacini territoriali e si stanno allargando ancora. Ci sono delle domande, forse per molti questi argomenti sono un po' nuovi, queste relazioni genetiche, però immagino che abbiate colto le potenzialità e l'interesse di questo approccio. Le domande sono stimolanti, credo che ci sia bisogno ancora di ragionare di altri dati per arrivare a una ricostruzione storica di fenomeni grandi, sui quali mi auguro che non ci si faccia, cioè che si ragioni in maniera spregiudicata, quindi basandoci sui dati più che su idee già, così, su convinzioni già diffuse. Ci sono questioni, domande? Avete dei dubbi? Siamo un po' stanchi, quindi ora c'è il break, ma se avete domande oppure le rimandiamo al dibattito finale, se Istvan riesce a rimanere con noi ancora un po', noi
Oh, yeah, sure.
Noi facciamo la pausa e poi riprendiamo con l'ultima relazione, dopodiché